Hi and welcome to Seen and Heard. My name is Allison Tristao and I'm the Community Field Representative at Wood. Today we have our CEO, Anja Raudabaugh, on to talk about the federal milk marketing order hearing that's coming up. So let's get into it.
This is Kathleen Wolfley from the Everag team, filling in for Tiffany LaMandola. Dairy markets continued to surprise this week. CME spot block prices pushed above $2 per pound for the first time since late March, finishing the week just shy of $2.03 per pound. Barrels were a little less frisky, but still closed the week above the $1.80 mark. I think the storyline in cheese really hasn't changed too much over the past few weeks. Contacts continue to cite tight milk supply, particularly in those cheese-heavy production regions like the Midwest and the Southwest. It's been hot in both of those regions, and school is reopening across parts of the country, and I think that that's pulling a bit more of that available milk supply into the bottling plants. Demand dynamics in the domestic market remain fair, while exports, on the other hand, are staying pretty busy after some strong July bookings. I think the big question now is how long will those exports hold, those strong exports hold? In our estimation, current high prices above $2 per pound may start to limit some sales into the fourth quarter and forward. Tuesday's GDT result was a bit of a doozy, with the overall index down by more than 7% from the prior auction. That is the lowest auction index going back to April 2020. Whole powder prices took the biggest hit, falling 11% from the prior auction, seemingly on the back of increased supply availability out of New Zealand and a weaker China demand. That China story is one that we're watching very closely. Skim milk powder, on the other hand, fell by about 5% and did ultimately put a bit more pressure on the U.S. non-factory milk market early in the week. On the other side of the Class 4 complex, CME spot butter prices hit a new year-to-date high on Thursday, reaching $2.77 per pound, but those higher prices did fail to hold on Friday, slipping 7 cents to finish the week at still a very stout $2.70 per pound. Volume was the big story in the spot butter trade this week, with 98 loads trading hands in the spot market. That's the biggest single week volume since 2004. Stay tuned, as next week brings several reports from USDA, with July's milk production report on Monday and cold storage on Wednesday.
Pacific Gas and Electric is here to remind you that signs keep you safe. Sections of our natural gas transmission pipeline travel underground and beneath agricultural land. For the safety of you, your family, and your employees, pipeline markers are placed to indicate the approximate location of the pipe as a reminder to use extra care. Removing a pipeline marker creates a serious safety hazard. To have additional markers placed or report damaged or missing markers, please call your PG&E account manager or our agricultural customer service center at 877-311-3276. To learn more, visit www.pge.com/agsafety. Remember, signs keep you safe.
Yosemite Farm Credit is the farmer's choice for agriculture financing. As a farmer-owned cooperative, we are dedicated to serving our neighbors in the agriculture community with financial products and services tailored to your operation and backed with the relationship you can trust. Whether you're purchasing real estate, making improvements to the dairy, or wanting to purchase or lease equipment, we're here to help our members prosper. Visit our website at YosemiteFarmCredit.com to find a branch location nearest you.
Today we have Anja Raudabaugh, the CEO of Western United Dairies, on to talk about the federal milk marketing order. How are you, Anja?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Can you just start by summarizing what the federal milk marketing order is and kind of go into summarize that?
Definitely, and I think for our audience's preference, if you are not a dairy farmer or a dairy policy wonk, you might want to just go ahead and click to the next episode. This is going to be an extremely heavy policy debate, but I am not a dairy economist and thankfully have many very talented economists in our employ. So they're going to be given some more details on this in the next few weeks. But from my point of view and the layman's point of view, the purpose of an FMMO, a federal milk marketing order, is to ensure an adequate national supply of fresh and wholesome milk for fluid consumption. The FMMO is also supposed to ensure that dairy farmers have stable and reliable markets to ship their milk as well. The system ensures that minimum prices, usually through pooling, are as well as accurate and transparent payments are also available to both the farmers and the public. And one of the things that's a big piece of an FMMO is weighting products, testing, and again, going back to accuracy. So certain provisions in an FMMO under which dairy processors purchase fresh milk from farmers they basically supply a marketing area. And in a federal order provision, dairy processors, and this is important, are referred to as handlers, and dairy farmers are known as producers. So you want to think about a marketing area generally defined like geographically, where handlers sort of compete. This is the idea for packaged fluid milk sales. And there's other factors that can kind of be taken into account on the boundaries of where a marketing area is. But for our purposes, we exist in a marketing area called California Federal Order number 51. And so federal orders serve to maintain a really stable relationship for handlers and producers, i.e. processors and farmers. And so their job in that moment under the federal order with USDA supervision is to make sure that they supply those marketing areas and essentially facilitate the process of marketing fresh milk. Now, an FMMO can be modified, and USDA has to call a very public hearing to do so. And the last time there was any, I don't even want to call it substantial change to the FMMO, and so this is the national setting, where all of the federal order marketing areas come together and they basically lay out their beef. The last time anything like this was ever done was in the year 2000. So for a lot of us listening and a lot of us participating in the next few weeks of hearings, I would suggest this is kind of a once in a lifetime deal. California has a little bit more recent experience. Again, those of you who are close to dairy marketing and dairy economics know that in 2015, the California dairy industry petitioned USDA to let them into the federal order system. We were in a state marketing order before that, a statewide milk pooling system. And we were, I guess, rewarded with such an ask late in 2018, following a number of steps. So the federal order hearing, which begins next Wednesday on August 23rd, is a process that enables the dairy industry, so this is both farmers and processors, to submit proposals and evidence that support the establishment or amendments to a federal order provision. So the process allows those federal orders to meet, theoretically, the changing needs of the dairy industry. And so the hearing is an extremely big undertaking. They have booked out a facility, and they will be there for many, many months. And there will be many attorneys there, more attorneys than likely bureaucrats. There will be far more bureaucrats and attorneys combined to represent the interests of not just the cooperatives, but also the processors. I believe there are a few dairy farmers right now that are slated to testify, but we'll talk about some of those next steps for dairy farmers and for processors to testify. So the hearing that USDA has called that's going to start on August 23rd essentially started from the fact that Secretary Tom Vilsack, who was appointed with the election of Joseph Biden in 2020. He essentially indicated to the dairy industry very early on in 2021, after some requests that they wanted some modernization of the FMMO, that he would only hold a hearing if the dairy industry had consensus. And again, I won't bore the audience with talking about farmers and processors usually being in polar opposite spectrums, but I would say that the major trade associations for both the cooperatives and the International Dairy Foods Association, which represents the processors, they did decide to at least attempt a good faith negotiation. So those negotiations were essentially over things like, do we need to change how we price class 1? Do we need to change how we price cheese formulas? Do we want to talk about a manufacturing cost allowance, which in parlance is called a make allowance? It is a designated amount that's taken from a dairy farmer's check in order to process the products that the processor is making into marketable goods, like cheese, like butter, like whey, like powder. And so these issues, again, you can imagine that it was like snakes in a cave, never sure exactly which effort was in good faith. And ultimately, they did arrive at some consensus, particularly around class 1, and we'll talk about that. But at the end of the day, there was a massive fallout earlier this spring, with several members of the cooperative sector leaving IDFA and kind of throwing their hands up and saying, screw you guys. Needless to say, that resulted in the American Farm Bureau Federation putting forward its own farmer-based FMMO proposal, to which IDFA responded and put their own proposal in, which NMPF, the National Milk Producers Federation, not to be outdone, they collectively represent the cooperatives in the United States. They had to put their own proposal forward, which then prompted a series of reactions. There are a number of smaller dairy marketing regions throughout the United States that strongly disagreed with those three proposals in their own minor ways. Some of them were much more major, and that led to a rush of proposals into USDA. We ended up with over 40 proposals in the USDA to change the FMMO. To my surprise and chagrin, because I'm always happy to tell the audience when I have to eat crow, I was not betting that Secretary Vilsack was going to call a hearing under such circumstances. But sure enough, in late July of 2023, he announced that USDA would be holding a hearing on limited subjects on August 23rd. And so let me go through those limited subjects. I'm going to list them, but they are pretty exhaustive. So we have, I think the major pieces include what we call proposal number 1, which was submitted by NMPF, that is the National Milk Producers Federation, collectively known as the co-ops from my parlance. It is a proposal that seeks to amend milk component factors in Class 3 and Class 4 skim milk price formulas. And so in seeking to increase those component factors, we add in a lot of conversation around non-fat solids, true protein, and other solids. A lot of dairy farmers will understand they are paid differently for those things. We will have an analysis on how that will affect the California prices in a number of days here. So component and component class prices and advanced pricing factors, these were all pieces of the NMPF cooperative proposal, along with some minor changes to class 2, 3. So class 2 is, frozen products, frozen products. Class 3 would be mostly cheese. And then we have class 4, which is powder and butter. So there was a number of advanced pricing suggestions in this proposal that USDA, I will say, has accepted for debate. And that's an important component of where we are with the hearing. The hearing is essentially a forum for anybody to offer suggestions and debate the merits of why their proposal is sound. There's usually a judge along with USDA, that assists in making those decisions. But the first piece, which is the hearing, is an evidence collection tool. And you have either, each side will be given an opportunity to present the pro, and then there will, of course, be a con or an argument against. So going through the NMPF proposal, I think that there are a number of other pieces in there related to non-fat solids, milk component factors. Again, I don't want to bore the audience with all of the things that trigger changes here. But then there was additional proposals submitted by National All Jerseys, which mostly focus on class 3 and 4. And then as we go forward, NMPF also put in a proposal about surveyed commodity products. And this one is interesting because of how much cheese California makes. This proposal seeks to eliminate the cheddar cheese 500-pound barrel price from the entire protein formula. And they have some alternatives in there. And we will link all of the documents and essentially USDA's website to our website, so you can go there and actually read some of these proposals for yourself. I wanted to make sure I brought up the proposal that was submitted by the American Farm Bureau Federation. That's particularly interesting as it relates to component prices around butterfat. The American Farm Bureau is essentially proposing the butterfat price per pound, rounded to the nearest 100 cent, should be a weighted average of the U.S. average salted and unsalted butter survey prices. So that's potentially very significant for California. And then honing in on one more major adjustment to class prices and component prices submitted by our very own California Dairy Campaign here in California. Their proposal is very simple. It proposes to add mozzarella to the protein price formula, which is certain to garner opposition from our processors. So those are some of the big ones. I think that, I certainly could talk about the other 18 or 19 proposals that made it into consideration for discussion. But I would like to kind of hang out on the last proposal that I think will certainly be the most heavy for everyone in the room, which is the proposal submitted by the International Dairy Foods Association, IDFA, which really focuses on updating current make allowance prices to farmers. And so the processors here have essentially suggested that the make allowance increase needs to be phased in over 4 years, but it can reach up to 37 cents additional taken out of farmers' checks for manufacturing cost allowances. So that's pretty significant. That's more than just a bale of hay. And I think that it's important to understand that the other proposals offered by varying associations, I want people to get very familiar with the point of view on those. Almost all of them do include some version of make allowance increase, whether it's 37 cents or 20 cents. There is some well-rounded acceptance that the manufacturing cost allowance has not been adjusted for 22 years or something like that. So if you think about inflation and what that's done to a dairy farm, this is the processor's argument for why they need a significant amount more in that make allowance price. Farmers who are who are used to dealing with not just the California order but also the federal order understand how contentious this is. I also hear very loud and clear that we all have to stay in business somehow. They couldn't have picked a worse year to suggest that this is the time to start this conversation. I'll leave that where that is. So I think that's kind of the good backdrop, but just some additional history on the FMMO and how it's handled in California. Right now, just because producers are already asking me, our quota program is in no way, shape, or form on the docket for this discussion. So let's just get that out of the way. That's a whole separate piece of what we're doing here in California. Thank the gods that that's not in the mix here with this conversation. But the FMMO goes back to like Depression era, politics and economics. Dairy farmers went to Congress back then seeking to offset what they perceived was an imbalance of power between the dairy farmers and the processors. And so the FMMO was born out of government regulations, an attempt to control that dynamic and really make sure that adequate food or adequate supply of fresh milk didn't go to like Farmer Joe, who cut a better deal with his processor, for example. Because that's how this mafiosa thing worked. It worked here in California the same way we entered the state system, which is that, you had a processor essentially only agreeing to pick up Farmer Joe's milk for, I don't know, $5 a hundredweight. And then he would basically swindle the neighbor, Farmer Frank, for $3 a hundredweight. And so that frustration led to just some stores not having any milk, some stores and schools not having any milk. And then, of course, a huge amount of frustration from dairy farmers. So there are actually a number of checks and balances in the FMMO system. In addition to ensuring those stable and reliable milk markets, the system ensures a minimum price guarantee, and they do that through something called pooling. And we can certainly talk about pooling. If you think about it, it's generally the mitigation of risk. You have a collection of lower prices coming in with a collection of higher prices, spitting out an average price. I would point out that generally speaking, the pool is only regulated in an FMMO for class 1. Everything else has a general option in some shape or form, depending on the marketing region, to depool or repool with certain rules. And so the value of the pool goes up or down, which ultimately affects the pay price to the dairy farmer. And there are actually 11 federal orders across the country based on regions. But it's important to point out, because I get this question a lot, that there are also large sections of milk production not covered under any FMMO in the United States. There's different reasons for that. At least one region had an FMMO and hated it so much that they voted to get out of it. Another one had an FMMO and they hated it so much that they decided not to show up and vote, which by default meant that the federal order that they had in that area went away. So that's lots of fun. Certainly, if we get further along in this process, we will talk about the rules and what a farmer's obligation is to make sure that he can protect his family in this moment. But another thing to point out that, again, I think got lost in some translation with some of the proposals that were submitted to USDA is that the FMMO and USDA does not actually regulate farmers. They regulate class 1 milk handlers. So basically processors that sell fluid milk products. Those processors are the only ones that USDA actually regulates 100% of the time. So about 95% of all fluid milk nationally is in fact covered by a federal order, while a few state orders kind of cover the rest. But less milk falls under the FMMO as the dairy industry is changing, which is why I think Secretary Vilsack did appreciate that this is kind of a historic time in the dairy industry. So just some statistics to leave farmers or anybody that's curious about this conversation with. Total milk production in the United States, less than 61% of it is actually part of a federal order. And that's down significantly. So this is 2021 or 2022 numbers. In 2019, 72% was covered. And so you can see between cooperatives and processors, they are making decisions for their businesses to pull out of FMMOs and depool those class 3 and 4 products because the market is essentially sending signals for them to do so. People are saying they want more cheese, they need more butter, they want more whey, they want more powder. And so generally speaking, cooperatives or processors are much more comfortable coming out of the USDA pool and theoretically sharing the profits with the farmers that they might make from those transactions. But at the end of the day, it's resulted in about 60% of all the milk being covered by a federal order. So then the natural question is, well, why do we need a federal order if like a majority of the milk is out of it? Dairy economists have wildly different opinions on this. But I think certainty, reliability, and again, the promise of a base floor for pricing, at least on the farmer side, are things that I hear every day. And so the conclusions are, before we head into this hearing, that essentially more dairy production is going into processing than any other fluid market. And I think that this is something that our checkoff programs, we've widely talked about it in our updates. People are definitely buying dairy products. They're just not buying as much fluid milk as they used to in the 60s and 70s, for example. And so that there's also this wider gap regionally as dairy farmers in the upper Midwest, for instance, sell more of their milk to cheese processors rather than the fluid markets. So that's caused a huge shift in how those things happen. And then just to kind of leave it so people can continue to ponder this, class 2, 3, and 4 on the processing side, so essentially people that process cheese, butter, or other dairy manufactured products, are only part of an FMMO if they elect to participate in that program. So they have the option to pool or depool. And as of 2021, only 52% of those non-fluid processors are covered by a federal order. So these processors do, however, choose, and we've seen that with a lot of, I think, regularity in California, to jump in and out of the system. So I think that just because we have such a vast array of types of members in Western United Dairies, which we're really proud of, I don't want to be remiss in mentioning the organic trade proposal that was not accepted. And there's a number of reasons why it wasn't accepted by USDA. But the Organic Trades Associations, which is kind of a newer national association, kind of a amalgamation of a lot of trade associations. Basically, they're very disappointed, but their idea was to try to exclude the organic dairy sector entirely from being covered by an FMMO, when the reality is a lot of organic dairy still actually does go to fluid milk. I know they're certainly seeing their own changes in marketing the way the conventional dairy sector is, but at this time, USDA's plan does not include that. I think it was just a leap too far with 40 proposals for consideration. It was just something that the secretary was like, well, you're asking us to basically make an exception to this class 1 implementation rule or inclusion rule. So the coalition has been pretty widely disappointed. I would point out that coalition, though, for the organic trade associations was predominantly made up of organic processors. So as a farmer-based trade association representative, it's my opinion that they just wanted to depool. So having said that, I think that the next step, again, this begins on August 23rd. And let me review briefly for everyone who wants to know when they can actually submit proposals. I'll give you guys the timeline.
My next question is going to be, tell us how you really feel.
Well, I feel apprehensive. That's really how I feel. I feel very fortunate that Western United Dairies hired me in July of 2015, which meant that my almost first work assignment was to sit next to Annie Akmuting during 40 days and 40 nights of testimony for the California dairy industry to try to transition into the federal order process. And so I feel very fortunate to have seen that hearing because I know the contention that's coming. I'm also very fortunate to have sat through 3 pricing hearings in California while we waited for the federal system to take effect. And contentious is an understatement. You have farmers fighting processors and processors fighting farmer, and all the old shit gets drug up. I mean, from the grave. And these are very passionate testimonies. The reality is we need each other, but I think there's some other ways to do it than asking the government to get involved. That's my personal opinion, it's not my board's. So thinking about how you as a dairy farmer can participate in an FMMO. So like I mentioned, the hearing will convene at 9 a.m. Eastern Time in Carmel, Indiana. No, not Carmel, California, Carmel, Indiana. And the advanced exhibit submission schedule is very, very tight. Starting on Monday, most exhibits are due. So if you want to think about the economists getting a paycheck for the next 16 years, they are basically writing these exhibits that back up each form of proposal of the 20 proposals that were accepted. So like a milk composition exhibits are due on Monday. The surveyed commodity products exhibits are due Wednesday next week. And then you have the class 3 and 4 formula factors, which are due the Wednesday after that on the 30th. You will have a number of other exhibits about base class 1 skim prices due on September 6th. Class 1 and class 2 differentials will then be due on September 13th. So these exhibits are going to be part of the public documentation and part of the Federal Register that helps assess or helps USDA assess how to make its decision. For farmers who want to be present, it's important that if you wanted to buy a plane ticket out to Carmel, Indiana, you could, but you can also be in person virtually on any day during the hearing, especially on Fridays. They seem to be having some tough technical difficulties about whether or not they can offer virtual visits by farmers every day. So TBD. But then starting Friday, September 1st, and each Friday following until the hearing concludes, farmers may testify virtually in 15-minute slots. There will be 10 slots available every Friday for virtual testimony. And to testify virtually, dairy farmers must pre-register. If you have any questions about wanting to testify, if you would like Western to assist you with your testimony, we are more than happy to do that. Again, like I mentioned earlier, we will have links on our website about all of this information. And best wishes, we will have a little bit more detailed analysis in the coming weeks on how each of these proposals will affect your prices here in California. It's particularly stark because we have so little class 1 utilization in California. So, yeah.
I have a quick question. Will this even really affect California very much?
A make allowance sure as hell will.
So just that one proposal will, but most of the proposals won't, right? Because I thought since it is class 1 drinking milk, I mean, that's hardly anyone here in California. I thought that was mostly on the east, right?
What I didn't mention overtly, and it's important to mention now, is except the Farm Bureau Federation's proposal or the Dairy Campaign's proposal, each of the other major proposals also includes adjustments to the make allowance. And I think I hinted at that earlier. It's not quite as high as the IDFA proposal, which is 37 cents. But there is a hit in almost every single one of these proposals to dairy farmers. This is money that essentially they will be authorized by the government to take out of a farmer's milk check to cover their manufacturing costs. It's not for nothing, and every farmer needs to have that conversation with their processor about how and why that's going to be handled that way. I would suggest that co-ops already have the authority to do this, but the conversation is now being had nationally, and so people are going to have to pick which side of the coin hurts the least, especially if you're a farmer-based association. But because California has so little class 1 utilization, as you just mentioned, we really are looking at how those class 3 and 4 price adjustments, the component pricing, we make a ton of mozzarella in California. So including that in the protein price is interesting. Let's talk about that. Now there's some water weight issues there too, but this is why I will look forward to the economists' analysis, which a lot of them really can't do until they get the exhibits. By the way, that's why we're kind of doing this preface update. They have to see what charts and all the information that the number crunchers put in there. But I do think that what ended up and got put on the docket for consideration has a significant ability to both help California's federal order and or hurt our farmers. So usually USDA lands somewhere in the middle on a lot of these things, right? It's just like two sides in court arguing the extreme point of view. What I saw in our federal order process was them landing just about as vanilla as you can get. There's no scoop of chocolate. There's no strawberry. It's as vanilla as you can get. And so a few of these proposals I think are quite radical. We'll see. But one of the worst things you can do in a democratically run semi-socialist milk system is to not allow debate. So I think Secretary Vilsack was in a real tough spot with all of the processors and all of the farmer groups saying, but we have our proposals, let's have the debate, right? So as a politician, that was probably the safest course of action with the remaining years he has as secretary.
Got it.
So we'll see. It's a really good question, though. I had to eat crow. I did not think that this was going to be he said over and over again, I want consensus-based process. I will not call a hearing unless there's consensus.
Yeah.
And with the drama that happened back east in the spring, I was like, all right, well, that's cool. We're not going to have a hearing, I guess. But boy, are we getting a hearing and a 7-course meal and a circus and a zoo at the same time. So I'm also horrified that the amount of consultant money that's going to be spent on all sides to go through this process it's going to be tens of millions of dollars, if not more, to even get over the finish line in the next 2 months. So yeah, I hope everybody enjoyed this exhaustive FMMO update.
Thanks, Anja. Thanks again, Anja, for coming on the podcast, and thank you to those who are listening. If you would like a notification when a new episode releases, you could subscribe to the podcast. Have a great week.
Are you tired of hearing that the main way to save water is fallowing? Are you tired of seeing articles about how alfalfa and corn waste water? At Common Good Water, we combine the best-in-class subsurface drip system and precision crop management services, including pest control. Our verification program qualifies for public funding, and we want to help you continue farming in California. Contact your groundwater sustainability agency and ask how you can work with Common Good Water. Visit commongoodwater.com.
Did you know that you can turn your dairy manure into cash? Bennett Environmental is offering above-ground dairy digesters at no cost to you. These systems can also remove nitrates from your lagoons to help you comply with water board regulations. Our proven above-ground technology will generate income for your dairy into the foreseeable future. Because we truck the renewable natural gas off-site, your dairy can profit regardless of your location. Bennett Environmental, turning your wastewater liabilities into sustainable assets. Learn more at bennett-environmental.com.
Thank you to the Western United Dairies generous business sponsors, the Morning Star Company, Holt of California, Farm Credit Alliance, PG&E, Arata, Swingle, Van Egmond and Goodwin Law Offices, Yosemite Farm Credit, F&R Ag Services, Moss Energy Works, California Dairy Magazine, Bennett Environmental, and Common Good Water. We appreciate our sponsors and thank them for their continued support. While Western United Dairies respects the varied views of our guests, please note that the opinions expressed in the Seen and Heard podcast may not necessarily reflect the positions of the Western United Dairies Board of Directors or our sponsors. If you would like more information on how to sponsor Western United Dairies or this podcast, please send us an email at info@wudairies.com.